In the winter of 1942, the Americans stepped onto the shores of North Africa, carrying new uniforms, new equipment, and enormous confidence, but very little of what mattered most in war: experience. Operation Torch had unfolded in November, with bright headlines and political momentum. Yet beneath the surface, the U.S. Army was still learning how to fight a modern, mechanized enemy. Most of the men in the 1st Armored Division had trained on dusty American fields against imaginary opponents, and the infantry of the 34th Division had never faced live German fire. They were well-fed, well-supplied, and optimistic, but they did not yet understand the speed, violence, and precision that characterized the seasoned veterans of the Afrika Korps. Across the desert, Erwin Rommel's men had survived the battles of Cyrenaica, Gazala, and El Alamein. They knew how to read the wind over distant dunes, how to mask a column of panzers in morning haze, and how to strike with narrow, concentrated force before the enemy knew what direction the danger was coming from. Rommel himself, even as his health waned and his supply lines stretched thin, understood he was dealing with an opponent that was technically strong, but tactically untested. For the Americans, the first weeks in Tunisia brought small clashes that hinted at a truth they did not want to accept. Recon patrols from the 1st Armored returned shaken after being hit by German 88s firing from ranges they had barely believed possible. Tank crews saw their M3 Lees and early M4 Shermans knocked out by disciplined German gunners who needed only 1 or 2 shots to cripple a vehicle. Infantrymen wrote in letters home that the Germans moved like ghosts, using terrain with a confidence that made American positions feel exposed no matter how carefully they dug in. Yet the American High Command underestimated these warning signs. Lieutenant General Lloyd Frettenball, directing 2 corps from a bunker more than 70 kilometers behind the front, believed that dispersed defensive positions and rigid orders would keep his lines safe. But his battalion commanders in the field struggled to interpret vague instructions, which often contradicted the realities they faced. Without integrated training, the Americans fought in disconnected pieces: tank units advancing without close infantry support, infantry attacking without coordinated artillery cover, and artillery firing without continuous observation. In contrast, the Afrika Korps functioned like an organism whose parts had fought together for years. When German patrols harassed an American outpost, mortars followed within minutes, and panzers soon appeared to exploit any weakness revealed. The Americans noticed that the Germans rarely attacked blindly. They probed, tested, and struck only when they sensed hesitation. Among the soldiers in the forward lines, a quiet tension grew. They respected their equipment and trusted their fellow men, but they sensed that the coming battles would not resemble the exercises back home. North Africa was not a proving ground, it was a crucible. Eisenhower watched these developments with increasing concern from his headquarters in Algiers. As Supreme Commander, he understood that materiel and manpower alone could not replace experience and doctrine. Reports from the front described confusion under fire, units pulling back without clear orders, and commanders unaware of enemy movements until German armor was already in their rear. Yet Eisenhower also recognized a potential beneath the disorder. The Americans adapted quickly when pushed. They learned from mistakes. They embraced new tactics when properly shown. The problem was not the soldier, it was the system. Meanwhile, German commanders like von Arnim and Rommel saw an opportunity. If they struck the inexperienced 2 corps hard enough, they could delay the Allied advance toward Tunisia, disrupt the growing pressure on Axis forces, and perhaps force the Allies into a prolonged campaign that would buy time for reinforcements. By January 1943, Afrika Korps intelligence concluded that the American lines, especially near Fade Pass, were vulnerable, poorly coordinated, and slow to react to rapid armored thrusts. As the desert nights grew colder and the wind pushed sand across the ridges, the Americans sensed something was coming, even if they could not yet imagine its scale. The Green Army that had walked ashore with cautious optimism now stood on the edge of its first true test, one that would determine not only the fate of 2 corps, but the future of American participation in the European theater. The road to Kasserine was opening, and the men marching along it had no idea how harsh the lessons ahead would be.
Under the pale February sky, the tension along the Tunisian front deepened. as German reconnaissance patrols grew bolder, slipping between American outposts with unnerving ease. The young soldiers of II Corps sensed patterns they could not yet interpret: columns of dust on distant horizons, engines rumbling at odd hours, radio intercepts hinting at movements too coordinated to be routine. On makeshift maps spread across ammunition crates, company commanders tried to track reports from the field, but the picture never quite came together. Orders from headquarters remained vague, emphasizing static defense rather than mobile response, and officers in the line struggled to understand what their superiors intended. Fredendall had carved the landscape into a maze of lettered sectors, each assigned to subordinate units in ways that ignored natural terrain and disrupted communication. Outposts were scattered across isolated ridges that often could not support one another. When an officer requested permission to reposition his troops into a more cohesive line, the answer from the rear came back clipped and final: hold where you are. Meanwhile, Rommel, who had returned to Tunisia after temporarily yielding command at El Alamein, saw a fleeting chance to regain initiative. His supply situation was poor, his forces battered, but the Americans presented a target too tempting to ignore. He recognized that their armored units moved cautiously, as if still practicing maneuvers in Louisiana, and their infantry often bivouacked in exposed valleys rather than on defensible high ground. He believed that if he could break their confidence early, he might destabilize the entire Allied timetable in North Africa. On February 14, the storm finally broke. At Faid Pass, elements of the 21st Panzer Division struck with the precision of an army that had spent years perfecting desert warfare. German tanks appeared at dawn, rolling out of a low haze that concealed their numbers until they were already closing the distance. The Americans responded bravely but disjointedly. M3 Lees pushed forward without infantry escort. Sherman crews misunderstood radio calls, and artillery batteries struggled to find firing positions where they could hit the advancing panzers without exposing themselves to counterfire. German 88s hidden along the flanks opened up at extreme range, and tanks that American crews believed safely shielded behind dunes suddenly burst into flames. Survivors later recalled the shock of seeing shells tear through their armor so cleanly that some men did not realize they were hit until smoke filled the turret. Throughout that day and the next, the pattern repeated itself. Small American victories dissolved under pressure because units lacked the practiced coordination to exploit them. Reconnaissance was thin and communication inconsistent. Where the Germans probed, they found seams between American battalions wide enough to drive motorized columns through. Withdrawal turned into retreat, then into near rout, as units fell back toward the interior passes under growing pressure. By the time German forces funneled into the Kasserine region, the Americans were no longer simply defending positions, they were struggling to regain cohesion. But even within the chaos, individual acts of bravery emerged everywhere. Anti-tank gunners remained at their pieces long after infantry had pulled back, firing until panzers were nearly on top of them. Medics dashed across open ground to drag wounded men into cover. Tank crews fought on, even as their radios failed and visibility dropped to near zero in dust clouds kicked up by both armies. These were green soldiers, but they were learning fast. Eisenhower, reading the fragmented reports arriving at Allied headquarters, understood the seriousness of what was unfolding. He had believed the Americans needed time to mature on the battlefield, but time was now being purchased at a steep cost. The disaster building in the mountains of western Tunisia was more than a tactical defeat. It was an X-ray revealing every weakness in the army he commanded. Confusion in leadership, poor integration of forces, lack of reconnaissance, and most of all, inadequate preparation for modern mechanized warfare. But even as German spearheads pressed deeper into the passes, they did not find an army ready to surrender. The Americans were shaken but not broken, and in that gap between failure and collapse, the seeds of transformation had already begun to take root.
By February 18th, the jagged ridgelines around Kasserine Pass echoed with the uneven rhythm of retreating American units trying to reorganize under relentless pressure. Dust clouds rolled across the valley floor as half-strength companies attempted to establish blocking positions, only to be flanked again by German armored columns that moved with predatory precision. For the men on the ground, the battlefield felt alive, shifting beneath their boots faster than any manual or field exercise had ever prepared them for. Lieutenant colonels found themselves cut off from battalions they were supposed to command, and platoon leaders relied more on instinct than on orders that arrived hours too late. Still, Fredendall's headquarters insisted on holding rigid lines and issued commands divorced from the terrain, placing units where they could neither support each other nor withdraw in good order. Meanwhile, Rommel, sensing the Americans' disarray, committed elements of the 10th Panzer Division to exploit the developing breakthrough. His aim was not simply to punish II Corps, but to burst through the passes and threaten the entire Allied position in western Tunisia, linking up with Axis units under von Arnim to deliver a coordinated blow. German columns moved with ruthless economy. Reconnaissance motorcycles darted forward to test defenses, followed by panzers advancing in wedge formations, and behind them infantry riding half-tracks ready to dismount at the moment of contact. In contrast, the Americans fought in fragments, company by company, ridge by ridge, each commander improvising with whatever forces he could gather. At Thala and Jebel Samama, American and British artillery units rushed into firing positions, knowing they were the only anchor capable of slowing the German advance. The gunners of the 9th and 16th Field Artillery Battalions, many of them firing 105mm howitzers in combat for the first time, unleashed accurate volleys that stunned even veteran German tankers. Their fire bought precious hours, during which engineers blew bridges, infantry set new defensive lines, and stragglers rejoined their units. Yet despite these stand-up fights, the overall pattern remained grim. German armored thrusts punched through gaps with alarming speed, and by February 20th, their forward elements pushed deep into Kasserine Pass itself. Panzer IVs navigated the narrow defile, their engines echoing off the cliffs, while American defenders scrambled to reposition. For many U.S. soldiers, this was the closest they had ever come to collapse. Radios hissed with contradictory messages, ammunition ran low, and casualties mounted. But in the midst of the chaos, something began to shift. Junior officers who had once deferred to distant headquarters now took initiative, coordinating cross-unit withdrawals, directing artillery by map rather than by observer, and rallying fragmented platoons into cohesive defensive clusters. They had been green a month earlier. They were not green anymore. The Germans noticed this change too. Their initial breakthroughs had sliced through unsteady lines, but as they drove deeper, they encountered resistance that stiffened with every mile. Exhaustion also began to take its toll on the Afrika Korps. Supply lines stretched thin across harsh terrain, fuel convoys risked Allied air attacks, and infantry moved slower than Rommel needed for the decisive exploitation he envisioned. On February 22nd, as German forces attempted to push beyond the pass, they ran into a wall of concentrated Allied artillery. British on one flank, Americans on the other. More than 200 guns opened up in overlapping barrages that shattered the momentum of the attack. Panzer commanders reported they could barely move without drawing fire. Rommel, realizing the window for a breakthrough had closed, reluctantly ordered a withdrawal. The battered American II Corps held the line. They had been outmaneuvered, outshot, and repeatedly pushed back, but they had not broken. As the last German vehicles slipped back through the mountain passes, the stunned American soldiers looked out over the battlefield littered with burned tanks, shell craters, and abandoned equipment. They understood they had survived, not because of skill or doctrine, but because they had endured long enough to learn the cost of inexperience. Eisenhower, reading reports from the front, grasped the full significance of what had occurred. Kasserine Pass had exposed every flaw in the young American army, but it had also provided the raw material for change. What came next would determine whether the United States remained an inexperienced newcomer or transformed into a modern force capable of defeating the Wehrmacht. The reckoning was coming, and Eisenhower intended to meet it head-on. In the days following the battle, the scale of the crisis became unmistakable. Columns of exhausted soldiers trudged back toward reassembly areas near Tebessa, their uniforms caked with dust, their faces drawn tight from sleepless nights and the shock of having fought the Africa Corps at full strength. Wrecked M3 Lees smoldered beside the road, twisted by high-velocity impacts that left scars far deeper than metal. Sherman crews inspected their remaining vehicles in grim silence, realizing how quickly a tank duel could be decided by experience alone. Medics sorted casualties under canvas tarps, while supply officers tried to account for lost guns, broken radios, and missing vehicles. Yet, beneath the exhaustion, a hard new understanding had settled in the ranks. They had seen the Germans at their peak, and had survived long enough to realize that courage alone was not enough. Victory demanded discipline, coordination, and the ability to adapt under pressure. Eisenhower arrived at forward headquarters to conduct a direct assessment. He listened to reports of contradictory orders, weak reconnaissance, units operating in isolation, and commanders unable to visualize the battlefield from far rear bunkers. He saw that the American Army had not failed because its soldiers lacked bravery, but because its leadership structure and training system were not yet ready for modern mechanized warfare. The conclusion was unavoidable. Dramatic reform was necessary. Eisenhower moved quickly. He relieved Lloyd Fredendall of command, a decision that had been growing inevitable since the first retreat at Faid Pass. In his place, he appointed Lieutenant General George S. Patton, a commander whose strict discipline, clarity of orders, and instinct for armored warfare had already become legendary in the U.S. Army. Patton's arrival at 2nd Corps headquarters on March 6th felt like a shockwave. Soldiers heard his staff cars before they saw him. He stepped out in polished boots, a gleaming helmet, and riding gloves, projecting authority with every movement. His first inspection revealed everything he needed to know. Men lounging with unbuttoned uniforms, weapons not cleaned after battle, vehicles parked without proper spacing. Patton did not tolerate it for a second. He reinstated strict dress codes, daily inspections, and clearly defined chains of command. He insisted that every officer be able to explain precisely where his unit was, who it supported, and what its mission would be at first light. These changes were not cosmetic, they were psychological. Patton believed that an army that looked disciplined would fight disciplined. He restructured defensive lines, consolidated scattered units, and demanded that tank, infantry, artillery, and engineers train together rather than as separate branches. This combined arms approach was exactly what the Africa Corps had used so effectively against them. Patton drilled his officers on maneuver warfare, emphasizing aggressive reconnaissance and rapid counterattack rather than passive defense. Meanwhile, Eisenhower authorized additional artillery units to reinforce 2nd Corps, recognizing that fire support, not tank duels, would become the backbone of American strength in Tunisia. Veterans from British 8th Army shared their hard-earned experience with American gunners, teaching them how to mass fire from dispersed batteries and shift barrages within minutes. Morale began to shift. Soldiers who had felt humiliated after Kasserine now sensed the army was changing around them, growing sharper, faster, more confident. Patton personally visited units at dawn and dusk, speaking with tank crews, infantrymen, and artillery teams. He demanded professionalism, but also instilled belief. If the men of 2nd Corps were to face German armor again, he intended to ensure the outcome would not resemble February's disaster. Across the field, German commanders also took measure of their opponent. Reports from the Africa Corps warned that the Americans were reorganizing rapidly, adopting British artillery methods and showing better discipline in forward positions. Rommel understood the threat. A well-supplied industrial giant that learned quickly was far more dangerous than an untested one. But by March, Rommel was ill and preparing to depart Tunisia permanently, while Axis supplies dwindled to a trickle. The window for decisive action was closing. For the Americans, the question was no longer whether they could recover, but how fast.
And in the growing heat of the Tunisian spring, as engines were repaired, trenches reinforced, and training resumed at a furious pace, it became clear that the army taking shape under Patton and Eisenhower bore little resemblance to the one that had stumbled into the jaws of Kasserine Pass. A transformation had begun, one that would soon be tested in the sands east of El Guitar.
The transformation was visible everywhere by late March. In the scrublands east of Gafsa, soldiers of 2nd Corps trained from first light until the desert winds turned cold again, running live-fire exercises that forced infantrymen to advance under the thunder of their own artillery, something unthinkable only weeks earlier. Tank crews practiced bounding maneuvers with Sherman after Sherman, racing forward, firing, then peeling back while another platoon took its place. Engineers rehearsed rapid mine clearing, while liaison officers coordinated with fighter-bomber squadrons newly assigned to support ground forces. Patton demanded speed, clarity, and above all, coordination. No unit was to move without knowing who covered its flanks, what artillery would support it, and how reconnaissance would keep the Germans from repeating the surprise thrusts that had shattered them before. The men felt the change in themselves. Letters home shifted from uncertain descriptions of the enemy's skill to confident reflections on their own growing competence. Artillerymen took pride in their new precision, massing 105mm and 155mm guns onto single grid squares with frightening accuracy. Infantry platoons learned to use terrain the way the Germans had, using folds in the ground to disappear from sight until the moment of contact. Tankers drilled until they could load shells by touch alone in the dark. They were no longer green troops. They were becoming an army. The Germans saw the shift before they ever met the American. U.S. outposts were now arranged in depth rather than scattered piecemeal. Counter-reconnaissance was aggressive, and American Africa Corps had expected a shaken opponent, recovering slowly. What they found instead was a force preparing, through exhaustion and discipline, to strike back. That opportunity came at El Qatar, a narrow valley stretching between steep ridges where Patton positioned his forces to block the advance of the veteran 10th Panzer Division. On March 23, German armor rolled forward, confident from past victories. But instead of disorganized lines, they encountered a defense constructed with mathematical precision. As the 1st Panzer IVs entered the valley, the ground erupted. More than 60 American guns opened fire in perfectly timed barrages. Forward observers hidden along the ridges adjusted the fire with uncanny speed. Tank after tank was caught in kill zones mapped out days earlier. German officers reported that they had driven into a trap, an American artillery system more coordinated than anything they had previously faced in Tunisia. Infantrymen of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, fought with new discipline, holding their fire until German units closed to effective range, then launching counterattacks supported by tanks and anti-tank guns. The chaotic retreats of Kasserine were gone, replaced by deliberate movements, planned fields of fire and tight and destroyed tanks, scattered infantry, and a stunned realization that 2nd Corps had become something else entirely. Patton, observing from a forward command post, remained stern even in success. "This is only the beginning," he told his staff. "We will not stop until Tunisia is finished." And indeed, Tunisia was nearing its end. As April turned into May, the combined pressure of British First Army, British 8th Army advancing from the southeast, and the now hardened American 2nd Corps squeezed Axis forces into an ever-shrinking pocket around Tunis and Bizerte. German and Italian troops fought stubbornly, but were outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off from reinforcements by Allied naval and air superiority. The Americans pushed through strongpoints with confidence unimaginable 2 months earlier. Infantry companies advanced behind creeping barrages, while Sherman tanks flanked fixed positions. What had once been a clumsy army was now an instrument that understood how to apply pressure with precision. On May 13, 1943, the last Axis forces in North Africa, more than 250,000 German and Italian troops, surrendered. The Africa Corps, once feared for its maneuver warfare genius, ceased to exist as an operational force. For the Americans,
Victory in Tunisia was more than a triumph of arms. It was a transformation forged in the harshest classroom possible. Kasserine Pass had exposed every weakness, but it had also provided the spark for rebirth. Eisenhower's reforms, Patton's discipline, improved training, and above all, the determination of thousands of ordinary soldiers had remade the U.S. Army into a force capable of facing, and eventually defeating, the Wehrmacht in Europe. As the dust settled over the ruins of Tunis, veterans of 2nd Corps looked back on the narrow mountain gap where their baptism of fire had begun. They understood now that their early defeat had not defined them. It had prepared them. The long road to Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and ultimately Germany began in those unforgiving passes of Tunisia, where an inexperienced army learned through blood and persistence how to become a modern fighting force.